in this video, I kind of want to continue some of the conversation that I was having before about my thoughts on executing Baudrillard on the AF and more effective ways of executing Baudrillard on the AF. I think these videos are particularly important, and I didn't say in the last video, but I will say in this one, that if you haven't watched the other videos I've done on Baudrillard, you definitely should, because I think that being able to really kind of piece these things together is really important, and looking at it holistically and drawing on some of the stuff that I've talked about in other videos is really, really important to really understanding this. I don't really make these videos so that I can get like complete total ideas of how all these authors are conceptualizing everything into one video. I try to do like as many parts as possible so that when I'm doing these kind of smaller size videos, you can kind of go through and piece together different places where I'm really sitting and talking about particular arguments that I think are particularly pertinent in certain situations, and then trying to piece together like how you think of Baudrillard and interpret it from there. Because I think that's like a really good starting point for how you generate really authentic and nuanced answers to the types of arguments that you'll see when you're debating Baudrillard and when you're trying to execute it. And so I think both ways it can really help to kind of be a quick reference for how you navigate this argument on both sides, and I think that that can be really helpful. And in this video, I kind of wanted to continue some of the stuff that I was doing in the last one when talking about how I think you can execute Baudrillard on the AF against like things like various case arguments, framework, topicality, criticisms, counterplans, and disads. In the last video, I talked a lot about case, framework, and topicality, and so in this video, I want to talk a little bit more about criticisms, counterplans, and disads to give the kind of like a little bit more context to just my total thoughts on what I think about how you should be executing Baudrillard on various portions of the flow, and how I think you can answer different types of arguments on the affirmative. I think that against criticisms, Baudrillard has a really interesting time. I definitely see different debaters or different people that read the argument sometimes be really successful or really unsuccessful debating against various criticisms. I think there are a lot of people that have really interesting to say about Baudrillard, both that are like kind of quoting from it and using him to make like various arguments that kind of bend some of his arguments to various different types of structural analysis or critiques. But I also think there are a lot of ways in which people critique Baudrillard, especially at the level of like thinking about Baudrillard in the context of like identity formation in terms of like race, class, gender, etc. And I think that from all of these standpoints, there are really interesting ways to think about how Baudrillard kind of functions in all these debates. I think that regardless of what kind of criticism is being alleged against you, the first piece of advice that I would have for any type of flow like this is similar to the one that I had in the last video, where I'm always going to say that kind of like winning the central kind of thesis claims that you're making about like the relationship between signs, signifiers, the relationship and the top level critique that you're making about debate will be really important against any criticism, because I think that it kind of gives you like a couple places for how you want to break down the K and the various places where you really want to be focused in on when you're kind of like going against the criticism. The first place that I think you really want to touch is what is the role that kind of like debate serves in all of this, i.e. what is the way in which the judge should just be evaluating the way in which the alternative and the affirmative interact with each other, with the affirmative and the links interact with each other, something that just explains what kind of the threshold is for you to be able to win the debate. And I think that a lot of the times you should kind of try to tie that kind of central framing question to whether or not you're kind of right about the different framings that you're doing of the world, and the way that you're kind of like framing the relationships that you're drawing on within your critique of the resolution and the world broadly, bringing that into the context of the debate and then explaining why debate should serve a particular purpose or not serve a particular purpose, right? Really allows you to think about how the judge should be doing a base evaluation of just like what the role of the criticism does in like its relationship to the AF in the first place, which can be a really strategic place to start the conversation, because from then on you're still able to have a full-on debate about whether or not your thesis is just applicable to how the negative is speaking and thinking about violence, which I think you definitely should try to think about, not in such a way that you just say the other team is right, but in such a way that you find a way to think about how they're considering various forms of structural violence in relationship to the way that your affirmative is kind of theorizing why that violence exists in the first place, and then tying that to the kind of affirmative arguments you're doing. I think can get you closer towards being able to win really interesting link turn and permutation arguments, even if you're not even moving in the same direction as the alternative. The alternatives or refusal argument, if you're winning and you're winning the ability to frame the kind of like literature in the way that the criticism is talking about the literature in such a way that you're able to really put yourself in a situation where you can fully weigh the value of your thesis against a lot of these arguments, then I think the permutation ends up being a really comfortable place for you to be in. And I think there are a lot of really interesting ways that you can create net benefits out of your ability to kind of like make distinctions maybe between things like form and content, which I've talked about in other videos, because I think when you're able to make arguments like the form content distinction, when you're making some of those earlier framing arguments in the criticism, you can make a lot of arguments about why, even if the criticism is right in the way that it's framing the world, that the way it goes about a particular study and the way that it mobilizes debate is incorrect, and that can kind of allow you to maybe presumption level gut check to the way in which the criticism is trying to garner specific net benefits outside of what the affirmative is trying to do. I think in the context of counterplans and disads, these are really interesting as Baudrillard asks, because I think that so the first mistake that I think I see a lot of Baudrillard teams doing is that a lot of teams, when they're reading Baudrillard and are talking about things like radical mimicry, they like will read plain texts that are kind of like really I or not explain them, like plan texts that are really extravagant, or plan texts that don't really seem possible, that are kind of like made up in a sense and are kind of like very imaginative. And a lot of times I see some Baudrillard teams really struggling with like how they actually want to use this plan text, and that can end up forcing them into debates that are really uncomfortable in terms of trying to think about the relationship between like actually having to defend the plan text and like the benefits of the stuff that you're talking about in terms of the epistemology for why like mimicry or the kind of act that the 1AC is taking up is good. And I think that in the context of counterplans this says, I think it's always net better to shy away from actually defending the plan text and its like implications materially, and always much better to go for an argument about why the ability for us to like think about debating policy only at the level of how policy currently exists in its current form only allows a recuperation of the kind of violence that you're critiquing at a top level. And in that sense, you have a reason why the kind of playfulness with the plan text has a particular reason for its performance, and also a reason why critiquing the kind of like normative relationship that the counterplanar dissad may be taking up to the law is net better. I also think that in a context where people get kind of creative with these things or just straight up read arguments that are just about kind of like impact turning, like for instance things like the hedge DA that are just meant up to be like really impact calc setup debates, I really think that the first place that you kind of want to start for how you're thinking about dissads is starting from critiquing the lens in which they try to get the judge to evaluate impacts, so the way they try to justify the dissad via its impacts. Because I think that for dissad debating, impact debating is such a crucial portion of how you really get these things to pop and make sense and override the value of the affirmative, especially when you don't really have strong link arguments, that when you kind of like have a really strong indite of this portion that actually just talks about the value of impact debating and justifying things through that type of calculus, it can be really hard for teams that aren't really ready to have a full-on debate about like the philosophical justification for even evaluating violence in the way that they do. And I think in that sense you can catch a lot of teams really off guard with creative ways to really push ways of like thinking about how you evaluate things like solvency and impact calculus by like centering some of these like thesis level claims that we've been talking about since like the beginning of the series, where you kind of pull together a lot of differences and things that I've been pulling from other videos like form and content, etc., to really make a kind of critical approach to the way in which they're thinking about politics and like the frame in which they do politics. Hopefully this video was helpful for you, and hopefully you'll tune into the last two videos I'll be doing on Baudrillard when I talk about answering Baudrillard. And thanks, I appreciate it.